February 1945. American prisoners of war are vanishing into Soviet territory. Not violently, not in the chaotic fog of battle sense. They are vanishing the way things vanish when a state apparatus has quietly decided that a particular outcome will not occur, and then deploys every bureaucratic mechanism available to prevent it, all while projecting the appearance of full cooperation with the people demanding answers. These are men liberated from German prison camps by the Red Army's westward surge through Poland and Eastern Germany in the war's final months. Soviet forces are steamrolling through the Stalags, the sprawling network of German POW facilities holding Americans, British and other Allied servicemen captured across years of fighting. Their liberation is incidental, a side effect of operations aimed at destroying German military power, not at rescuing prisoners. The men are being freed from German captivity. That is not the same thing as being returned to American hands. The Soviet government has explicit obligations here. The Yalta Agreement, signed by Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin in February 1945, lays out specific terms for repatriating liberated prisoners of war. Allied POWs are to be assembled at collection points, fed, sheltered, given medical care, sent home as fast as possible. The language is precise, the commitments are unambiguous, and the Soviets are violating them. The fragmentary reports trickling back to American military headquarters paint a picture that is deeply disturbing. Some liberated Americans are being held in the very same camps they were just freed from, still under armed guard, still short on food, still denied adequate medical treatment. Others are being transported eastward, deeper into Soviet-controlled territory, the exact opposite direction from home. Still others sit for weeks that stretch into months while the Soviet military bureaucracy processes repatriation paperwork with the unmistakable deliberateness of an institution instructed not to rush. The question of why the Soviet Union refuses to return American prisoners during the winter and spring of 1945 is one that historians have wrestled with for 8 decades now. Their answers do not contradict each other. One explanation centers on Moscow's own repatriation crisis. Millions of Soviet citizens spent the war years under German control, as prisoners, forced laborers, civilians trapped in occupied zones. Getting them back is a priority for Stalin. American cooperation with Soviet repatriation efforts is leverage, and leverage is not spent freely. Another explanation involves Soviet intelligence. American POWs have spent months, sometimes years, inside German-held territory. They have seen things, heard things. Extracting that information requires time and continued custody. A third explanation is structural. The Soviet military bureaucracy functioned through a blend of institutional inertia and purposeful obstruction so seamless that distinguishing one from the other is nearly impossible for anyone on the outside looking in. General George Patton has no patience for parsing the reasons. Patton commands the Third Army as it tears through Germany in those final months. His advance is exposing the full wreckage of the German war machine: concentration camps, POW facilities, displaced persons centers, forced labor installations. The physical residue of everything the Third Reich inflicted on the people trapped beneath it. All of this lands on Patton simultaneously. The logistical and administrative demands of an army in full offensive momentum, layered on top of one humanitarian crisis after another, as each new mile of advance uncovers the next horror. American prisoners trapped in Soviet-held territory represent a crisis Patton has no direct authority to solve. These men sit behind Soviet lines, ground where American military power carries no weight, held by an Allied army whose goodwill underpins everything the war's final chapter demands. The official machinery for resolving their fate climbs upward through the American chain of command to Eisenhower, then, laterally, into the diplomatic corridors linking Washington to Moscow. That machinery is producing results best described as inadequate. Patton knows this because officers dispatched to Soviet territory under the Yalta Agreement's contact team provisions are filing reports. These are American military personnel authorized to visit collection points where liberated prisoners should be assembling, tasked with aiding repatriation and confirming Soviet compliance with their obligations. The contact teams cannot reach the prisoners. Checkpoints stall them. Soviet officers inform them the prisoners have been relocated elsewhere. A bureaucratic apparatus churns out paperwork without yielding access. Patton's answer is to act without Eisenhower's blessing and against the official diplomatic posture of the United States government. He bypasses the Yalta contact team framework entirely. He sidesteps the channels that route upward through command and sideways through diplomacy, the same channels delivering the inadequate results he already knows about. He handpicks American officers who speak Russian and possess the precise blend of tenacity and adaptability that unauthorized operations in Soviet territory demand. He sends them east. Their orders are simple: locate American prisoners, document their real condition, their real location, their real treatment. What these officers bring back is grimmer than anything the fragmented intelligence trickling into Third Army headquarters has suggested. American prisoners endure conditions spanning discomfort to genuine peril. Men who survived years in German captivity are now sick and starving. Problems the Soviet collection point system lacks either the capacity or the will to address. Medical care mandated by the Yalta Agreement falls far short. Food is scarce. Shelter is woefully insufficient. The repatriation timeline, which the agreement specifies should proceed as rapidly as possible, bends to Soviet administrative rhythms that treat urgency as an abstract concept. Quote _0 _ means whatever Moscow decides it means. Patton carries this intelligence to Eisenhower, not quietly, not as a subordinate threading a concern through proper channels. He brings it with the force of a commander convinced that American soldiers are suffering at Allied hands, and that the suffering stems from deliberate policy, not bureaucratic accident. A deliberate policy demanding a response the official apparatus has failed to produce. Eisenhower absorbs this from a position of agonizing complexity. As Supreme Allied Commander, he understands Soviet military cooperation remains essential to Germany's final destruction. The Berlin question. The convergence of American and Soviet forces at the Elbe, dozens of coordination demands in the war's closing weeks, all hinge on a functioning relationship with the Red Army. A direct confrontation over prisoner treatment could fracture that relationship at the worst possible moment. Yet Eisenhower is also a man who has read the same reports Patton has read. He has pursued repatriation through diplomatic channels with a particular frustration of someone receiving cooperation's appearance without its substance. The diplomatic channel Eisenhower has been using runs through the American military mission in Moscow, headed by General John Dean. Dean has been managing Soviet coordination on repatriation and related questions since the mission's establishment in 1943. His reports from Moscow through the winter of 1945 document a specific repeating pattern. The Soviet military conducts its relationship with American counterparts through formal cooperation that always arrives on schedule, and substantive cooperation that never does. Agreements are reached, then not implemented. Access is promised, then not provided. Dean has been warning Washington since late 1944. The pattern reflects deliberate policy. Maximum American cooperation extracted, minimum Soviet cooperation returned. And the American strategy of accommodation is yielding diminishing results, because the Soviets have concluded the accommodation will continue no matter what they do. His recommendation arrives in a November 1944 cable. It becomes one of the more consequential documents in American-Soviet diplomatic history. The United States should stop making concessions without receiving concrete concessions in return. Washington receives this recommendation with the diplomatic ambivalence of a government caught between two imperatives: preserve the wartime alliance through its final phase, manage the mounting evidence that the post-war Soviet relationship will be far more adversarial than Allied solidarity rhetoric has suggested. But diplomatic ambivalence could not protect the men still disappearing in the East. The Roosevelt administration is not prepared to adopt Dean's harder line in November 1944. By the time anyone is ready to reconsider, Roosevelt is dead. Truman holds office. The war enters its final weeks, and the prisoner repatriation question has become simultaneously more urgent and more politically volatile. Patton is not navigating the diplomatic complexity that Eisenhower and Dean are navigating. He is running the Third Army, managing its operations, living with the human consequences those operations produce. And the human consequence currently consuming him is specific: American prisoners held in Soviet custody whose return is not proceeding at the pace the Yalta Agreement demands. He decides to launch a rescue mission. The decision carries no authorization from Eisenhower, no coordination with Soviet military command, no processing through the contact team framework. The Yalta Agreement establishes for precisely this type of operation. This is a unilateral call by a theater commander who has concluded the official channels have failed, and the men in Soviet hands cannot wait for those channels to deliver. The mission falls to Major Grunberg, one of the Russian-speaking officers Patton has identified for exactly this purpose. A man combining language capability with operational judgment in the proportions the task demands. Grunberg takes a small team east into Soviet-controlled territory. His objective is precise: locate American prisoners, begin moving them westward toward American lines. Regardless of what the Soviet military bureaucracy dictates about proper repatriation procedure. What Grunberg discovers upon reaching Soviet-controlled areas confirms the worst intelligence filtering back to Patton through unofficial channels. American prisoners are scattered across multiple locations. Conditions range from miserable to actively dangerous. Soviet military personnel responsible for these men operate under instructions that do not prioritize the repatriation Yalta requires. Grunberg starts moving men. He requests no Soviet authorization. He submits no paperwork through the contact team framework. He identifies Americans, gets them on their feet, and pushes them westward toward Third Army lines. The Soviet military responds to Grunberg's operation exactly as a bureaucracy responds when someone decides its timeline is unacceptable, and simply bypasses it. Confrontations erupt at checkpoints. Soviet officers demand documentation the mission cannot produce, because the mission was never authorized within any framework that would generate such paperwork. Communications flow from Red Army officers to their American counterparts, registering formal objections to the unauthorized operation, demanding it cease. Patton does not seize it. Those Soviet complaints about Grunberg's operation travel upward. They reach Eisenhower, arriving as official Red Army communiques expressing sharp displeasure at unauthorized American activity inside Soviet-controlled territory, requesting that American command order its subordinates back into established channels. Eisenhower finds himself in a position that is awkward in one very specific way. A subordinate has acted without authorization. But that subordinate is producing results the official channels have failed to produce. The thing that should not have been done is the thing bringing men home. Eisenhower sends communications to Patton about the necessity of working through proper channels. Patton receives them, acknowledges them, and continues the operation. This is Patton being Patton. The same pattern that has governed his relationship with authority throughout the entire war. The same tension between personal judgment an institutional hierarchy that produced the slapping incidents, the speech in England, and every other occasion where George Patton decided what was right, then dealt with the fallout afterward. His calculation here is simple. The consequences of saving American prisoners are survivable. The consequences of abandoning them inside Soviet custody are not. He acts on that math. And the men Grunberg's operation funnels westward start appearing at Third Army positions. Many of them in terrible shape. Months of German captivity, followed by weeks under Soviet control, have carved a physical toll that Third Army medical facilities now confront with corresponding urgency. Patton visits some of these men himself. These are not staged appearances, not the kind of choreographed political stops at military hospitals designed for cameras. These are a commander's visits. He wants to see firsthand what happened to soldiers held in someone else's custody. He needs to measure the distance between what the Yalta Agreement promised these men and what they actually got. What he witnesses in those visits hardens every instinct he has been cultivating since May 1945. About the Soviet system, about what it signals for the post-war order now assembling itself atop the wreckage of the German one. The American prisoners held by the Soviets were not subjected to the deliberate, industrialized cruelty of the German camps. They were not victims of a systematic extermination program or organized torture, but they were handled as instruments of Soviet policy, not as individual human beings possessing rights the Yalta Agreement had enumerated and the Soviet state was obligated to honor. They were detained longer than the agreement stipulated, moved in directions the agreement never envisioned, deployed as bargaining chips in a repatriation negotiation the Soviet side conducted on one core assumption, that American cooperation could be purchased cheaply, because Washington needed Moscow's military partnership more than Moscow needed Washington's goodwill. Patton speaks openly about this to his staff, in his diary, in conversations with a parade of visiting officials. The war's end is now drawing to Germany. Politicians, journalists, military brass from Washington and London, all arriving to witness what victory looks like at ground level. He says the Americans liberated the wrong people, that the Soviet system spreading across Eastern Europe is not some alternative civilization. It is an alternative barbarism, distinct from the one just defeated, but barbarism all the same. And the men who have returned from Soviet custody are living proof of what that system does with human beings once it holds them in its grip. The actual clashes between American and Soviet military personnel over prisoner repatriation in the spring and summer of 1945 looked nothing like the dramatic showdown Patton's rhetoric suggested. No armored columns rolling east, no ultimatums at gunpoint. These were smaller collisions, bureaucratic. Two military systems built on fundamentally different values, running different procedures, occupying the same ground, each claiming authority the other refused to recognize. Patton's role in these confrontations was straightforward refusal. He would not extend the accommodation that Washington's official diplomatic posture offered Moscow in exchange for cooperation on repatriation. The official American position treated Soviet violations of their Yalta commitments as logistical hiccups, problems to be smoothed over through negotiation, not deliberate policy to be challenged through force. Patton rejected that framing entirely. What was happening to American prisoners under Soviet control, that was the product of conscious decisions, not paperwork delays. And wrapping it in administrative language only delivered the outcome Moscow wanted: American compliance purchased with Soviet stalling. On this point, he was correct. He was also acting beyond the boundaries of his authority, taking steps his superiors never sanctioned, making declarations his government's diplomats would never endorse. That tension, being right while simultaneously exceeding his mandate, is the thread running through everything Patton did during the prisoner crisis. It runs through nearly every episode of those final wartime months where military action collided with political calculation. The repatriation question itself found no clean resolution. From the perspective of families whose men never came home, the outcome was incomplete, unsatisfying. Most American forces did eventually return through a combination of formal diplomatic pressure and the unofficial operations Patton set in motion. Operations Eisenhower quietly tolerated even as Soviet protests mounted. But not all of them came back. The accounting for American prisoners held in Soviet-controlled territory when the war ended remains unfinished. Men whose fates sit documented in Soviet archives never fully opened after the Cold War collapsed. Archives that subsequent Russian governments have kept sealed from American researchers and from the families still searching for answers. Whether American prisoners of war were detained inside the Soviet Union past the agreed repatriation window is a question the accessible evidence cannot fully settle. And the inaccessible evidence, those closed files, may or may not provide answers if anyone ever gains entry. What the existing record does establish is plain enough. The Soviet government failed to honor its Yalta obligations on repatriation in the spring of 1945. That failure was intentional, not accidental. Washington's official response fell short, and the most effective action taken against it was the unauthorized mission Patton launched after deciding that official channels had broken down, and that American soldiers trapped behind Soviet lines could not afford to wait for diplomacy to work. Patton was dead by December of 1945. He never saw the full scope of the repatriation failure come into focus, never witnessed the Cold War harden into the shape that would make his read on Soviet intentions look far less reckless and far more prescient than it seemed during those tense months after victory. He died convinced that America had abandoned the man left in Soviet hands, that the abandonment was a direct consequence of policy, a policy that valued the diplomatic relationship with Moscow above the specific human commitments spelled out at Yalta. He was not wrong about that. The soldiers who returned from Soviet custody after Grunberg's mission, arriving at Third Army lines in the spring of 1945, physically broken after months in German camps and weeks under Soviet control. They are the proof. Proof that his instinct was sound, proof that his action was justified, and proof that the official channels Eisenhower pursued, the diplomatic posture the American government maintained, were delivering results wholly inadequate for the men trapped on the other side. Those men came back because Patton sent someone to retrieve them, not through the framework the Yalta Agreement established, not with Soviet authorization, not with Eisenhower's blessing. Through the specific, unauthorized directness of a commander who had decided, consciously, deliberately, that the lives of Americans in Soviet hands outweighed the diplomatic relationship those official channels existed to protect. A commander willing to absorb whatever consequences followed, because he believed the decision was correct. He was correct, and the men came home. If you had occupied Patton's position, reading Grunberg's reports, knowing the official channels were failing, knowing men set in Soviet custody while their condition worsened day by day, what would you have done? Drop your answer in the comments and click the video on screen for the next one.